Greetings, everyone. Bill Roach, another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and today we're going to do something that's just a little different. Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about my new book that's just been released, and this is a proof copy of it, and it's called Defending Evangelicalism, the Apologetics of Norman L. Geisler. And the reason that I want to talk about this is that I really want to continue to discuss the legacy of my friend, my mentor, my professor, Dr. Norman Geisler. And I want to keep his legacy alive, but more importantly than the legacy of Dr. Geisler, I want to keep his commitment to classical realism, classical theism, the classic doctrine of inerrancy, and all that classic evangelicalism stood for alive in this present day and age. So what I want to do here is I want to just briefly discuss a little bit of this, but I want to make this just a little bit more personable than some of the other videos that we typically do. And I want to start out by saying just a few things here. One, I recognize that there are a lot of people who have worked with Dr. Geisler over the years. I am one of many individuals who has worked as an assistant to Dr. Geisler. I am by no means special in comparison to any of them. In fact, it's one of those, if you were to rank all of them, I'm probably at the bottom of that rank. So my goal here in producing this is not to exalt myself, but to summarize in a clear way the thought of what Dr. Geisler was trying to communicate through his teachings to all of his different students. So I just want to say that from the very beginning. But I want to make this a little bit more personal by showing you just something that Dr. Geisler gave me a number of years ago. And what it is it's a golden little hammer. And you may think, what's the significance of this? And he handed it to me, and I actually usually keep it next to my desk just as a reminder. And here's what I'm actually reminded of. So this fell off of there. I could probably put it back on. And it says this: the author holds the hammer, fastening words that are the nails that build books, inspiring readers with God's love that never fails. And in so many ways, that represents what Dr. Geisler tried to do through the power of the pen and through the pulpit. And what I want to do next is I want to give you an example of this. And, Dr. Geisler had a documentary put out titled Unqualified. And what it did is it discussed his background and the fact that he was virtually illiterate when he graduated high school and went on to publish well over 100 books throughout his career. And I think that's one of the things that's so inspiring to people, especially people like myself who did not come from an academic background or an academic family. And you wonder, can I actually ever learn this kind of stuff, more or less write a book about this stuff, more or less debate on this kind of stuff? And the answer is yes, by the grace of God. And Dr. Geisler was a figure that demonstrated that. So what I want to do here is I want to transition to a video that we made in his home a number of years ago. And this was actually a group of people that were invited, and we had a long conversation really on the thought of Thomas Aquinas, but some of us probed a little bit further, knowing that Dr. Geisler was getting sort of up there in years, and we wanted a few things on record. So as we look into this, I want to play a little bit of him talking about his testimony.
When I was first saved, I couldn't read. It took me 4 years of Bible school, almost 5 years of Bible school, to catch up on all my goofing off for all the years in school. I couldn't read. I was taking the Greek third year, and the Greek teacher found out we couldn't read English. We didn't know English, so he had to teach us English before he could teach us Greek. So it took me 5 years to catch up. If God hadn't worked patiently and graciously, as I often say, I am what I am by the grace of God and the grace of my dear wife. If I didn't have grace of God in my life and didn't have a wife like her, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. I mean, she would retype my papers, which were like, I did punctuation like a pepper shaker. We need some commas here somewhere, or some colons, something like that. So my grades were at least a grade better after she got through with the papers, until I could learn how to do it myself. She has been a terrific wife, truly helped me and supportive, never a drag, always supportive, and I thank God for his grace and for her.
So that's just a brief little thing of Dr. Geisler's testimony. And the reason that I bring that into it is that if you're watching this and you look at something with Dr. Geisler, you have to see that, he makes this joke that he did punctuation like a pepper shaker. This needs some, periods and some commas and some colons and all the rest. But that's what I want you to see about Dr. Geisler, is that he was an individual that truly represents this idea that God can use an individual who was unqualified to do great things. So with that said, what I want to do is I just want to transition here and talk about this book. So what this book tries to do is it tries to go through and summarize in the first chapter the history of thought in a very brief sense. In particular, I want to look at the concept of what is philosophical and theological modernity, because what that's trying to do is it's trying to look at really what became the crossroads for ideas that come up against the knowledge of Christ. Now, we recognize that's been happening much sooner than modernity, but in particular, what I want to do is I want to focus on, I focused on the specific things that came through skepticism, agnosticism, postmodernism, the responses to that from like theological liberalism, neo-orthodoxy, and even into neo-evangelicalism today. Because it's really a book on defending evangelicalism against modernity and against the synthesis of modernity within what could be considered classical Christian thought. So, for example, you have Immanuel Kant, who published the Critique of Pure Reason. And then you have a figure like Schleiermacher, who came in and said, Kant says a lot of very good things in this book, emphasis on good things and the quotations in this sense, when the reality is the things that Kant said are irreconcilable with the Christian faith. And what did he try to do? He tried to make this non-cognitive, non-propositional view and bring it into Christianity. And what it did is it killed the concept of revelation and the knowability of God. And from that, theological liberalism became a non-doctrinal, emotional, sort of live your life dependence kind of concept. And Schleiermacher was not the only one. You got Hegelian synthesis and his dialectical concepts. Within neo-orthodoxy, you've got syntheses with postmodernism. You've got syntheses today with critical race theory and all the rest. The point is that evangelicalism is a resistance movement to modernity. And what I try to do in here in the very first chapter is I try to just lay out what does that look like? How have evangelicals historically responded to it? And then what I do is I give a thumbnail sketch on why Dr. Geisler was unique amongst those evangelicals in the way that he went about responding to that. In particular, that brings us to the next section. Dr. Geisler recognized first and foremost that there's this concept what's known as prolegomena. Now, don't let that word scare you off. What it is it's trying to look at the philosophical preconditions that are necessary and required in order to do theology. So, for example, you can't have truths about God unless there's a concept of truth. You can't have truths about God unless there is a God. You can't have truths about God unless there is a God of truth. You can't have a discussion about the biblical miracles if there's a God that can't do miracles. You can't have a discussion about things like the clear, totally true, inerrant word of God if these ideas from Heidegger and other sort of existential thinkers and modern thinkers in that regard are true in their hermeneutic. Why? Because if you're going to allow this metaphysical situationalism and this historical situationalism to totally cut off the mouth of God because authors are so historically situated in their particular situation, then you don't have any true communication from God. That may be over some people's head. Let me summarize it in this sense. The point is that you have different philosophies that are irreconcilable with the Christian faith. And what Dr. Geisler tried to do in his Prolegomena was respond to that. And that's what chapter 2 of this book ends up being about. We look at this idea of what is classical realism. And classical realism, in short, is this idea that you have this metaphysical foundation upon which all of these other truths, the epistemological issues rest upon it, the linguistic issues rest upon it, the hermeneutical issues rest upon it. And that may sound like a lot for all of you. I explain that in clear detail in the book. Because the idea is this, is that we want to have the God of truth who created the entire world, and from that creation, he's able to reveal himself through creation and special revelation, giving you true knowledge of God and also a true understanding of the plan of salvation in the text of Scripture. Now, there's a lot more to that. That's a very simplified view. Excuse me. What I try to do is distinguish that from other ideas of what is realism or anti-realism and all the rest. My point is that I try to discuss in chapter 2, Dr. Geisler's concept of classical realism as the philosophical sort of response to modernity and synthesizing ideas. Now, the next thing that we talk about is that if it's grounded in this idea of classical realism, he's also grounding his view of God in classical theism. And classical theism is first and foremost a theism. So it recognizes that God created the world, and yet God is not the world. There's a creator and creation distinction. And that makes all of the difference, because when you look at creation, you find things like it had a beginning, it's in time, it's changing. But if God is not the creation, but the creator, then God would have no beginning, he would be unchanging, he would be eternal, and so on and so forth. And why this is so really important today is that so many evangelicals have bought into various forms of theistic mutualism or various forms of process theology, or this idea that Geisler would call it neo-theism, which is this notion that God is in time, that he's changing, that in many respects he bears the characteristics of the creation more than this distinct creator. So what I try to do in this chapter is I lay out that key and essential point, and I discuss not only the confessional aspects of it, but the true philosophical ideas that sort of undergird this and why it's essential. Because in many respects, you're going to have figures, if you want to compare classical apologetics, there's a radical difference between the classical apologetics of a William Lane Craig, who doesn't ground his stuff in classical realism and classical theism, versus a Norman Geisler that does ground his in a classical realism and a classical theism. And we could make a lot of distinctions between this. And, we could go on rabbit trails and look at other figures, and I list them within the book here. So many of the debates that you see that's going on right now on our doctrine of God, even within, people who would say, we're classic, confessional, and so forth. Well, you can't reconcile this theistic personalism or theistic mutualism or neo-theism. They're kind of used synonymously with things like the Westminster Confession of Faith or the London Baptist Confession of Faith. And yet, how many guys do we have that are championing, the presuppositional view of God? Well, in the presuppositional view of apologetics, who can't even reconcile their views with the confessional statements that they actually have to sign in order to work at the schools and in the churches that they claim to. Classical theism is the classic historic view of God taught really throughout the Orthodox Church history. Now, the next thing that we look at here is based upon classical realism and classical theism. It brings us to this idea of the classic doctrine of inerrancy. And we recognize there are so many figures out there today that are redefining the concept of inerrancy, or they want a flexible view of inerrancy, or they just outright reject inerrancy. And one of the things that you're going to find about Dr. Geisler and many of the classic evangelicals is that they didn't try to do that. Now, all definitions are nuanced definitions, but you can either nuance your view in pursuit of the truth, or you can nuance your view in a way that undermines the concept of truth. And what Dr. Geisler and other figures, sorry I keep coughing, I have had this perpetual respiratory flu that is getting better for like 4.5 weeks now. So I know I could edit this, but I do all these in one shot, kind of live-ish in one sense. That said, you have a lot of people today, and you're going to see with classic evangelicalism, that they didn't try to undercut the doctrine of Scripture. And what I look at here is I look at really the history of the inerrancy debates. I look at the rise of the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, but more than just looking at the history of it, I specifically engage and discuss the relationship between classical realism, classical theism, and the classic doctrine of inerrancy. Because one of the things that you're going to find with Dr. Geisler and other figures, I mean, for example, you want another, I'll give you a couple more figures that would be reconciled with Geisler's view on this. R.C. Sproul, classical realist, classical theist. John Gerstner, classical realist, classical theist, and so forth. And you've got many of these figures, and that's what we look at on this classic doctrine of inerrancy. We look at the concept of inerrancy. We look at how these issues relate to the nature of hermeneutics and inerrancy. We look at people who are departing from that, and the concept of objectivity that's required with the doctrine of inerrancy. Now, the final thing that I try to look at here is I try to situate this within the present day conversation, because it's one thing to say, you know, we champion classical realism, classical theism, and the classic doctrine of inerrancy, you know, hoorah idea. But it's another thing to actually apply that to a new situation. And what I want you to see is that these views are not just a view, but they're the perennial concepts of philosophy and theology that apply to all eras. You know, this idea that if we're not evolving with new things, somehow we're a dead view is just, frankly, incoherent and false. The reality is that truth endures. And what I try to do in this final chapter here is I try to bring this concept into the contemporary debates. And I want to look at how Geisler's view is a response to modernity and many of the contemporary issues. And I discussed many of those in that final chapter, but probably one of the bigger ones that I look at is how does this idea of the classic doctrine of God and the concept of truth apply to an issue, say, as critical race theory and intersectionality, and this idea of how these different diversity approaches of hermeneutics affect the way that we actually read the Bible. And there I engage with a very particular debate that took place really throughout most of evangelicalism over the last few years, as so many evangelicals were synthesizing that aspect of modernity with the Christian faith. Now, do I think it was a truthful synthesis? No, I think it was a heretical synthesis. I think their views, whether they recognize it or not, undercut Christianity just as much as Schleiermacher's synthesis or Barth and Bruner's synthesis with dialectical concepts. In fact, it's the existential method applied. And in particular, what I think these guys did is they synthesized this idea of Hermetic Gnosticism and race Marxism into the Christian faith. And what I do is I respond to that because I don't think there's any place for it within the Christian church. So that said, what I want to do is I want to reiterate just one final thing here. You know, you can find this online, and this is not a book that I want to just recognize me in. I want this to be a book that recognizes Dr. Geisler and his legacy. And in recognizing Dr. Geisler and his legacy, I can guarantee without a shadow of a doubt, especially now that he's passed on and he's with the Lord, it's not about exalting Dr. Geisler. It's exalting the God that Dr. Geisler served, preached, and proclaimed. It's exalting the lordship of Jesus Christ and what that looks like as we defend the historic Christian faith in this present day age and era. And, you know, one final thing here, I recognize that there are many, like I've said, there are many, many people who have worked with Dr. Geisler. There are many, many more people who are more capable and able, and I hope will one day write on this issue with it. This is just one of many books. I realize that there are many, many people who could have done this, and I would champion them if they go on and continue to do this. But this book for now is my work on this, obviously, and I would just encourage you to pick it up, take a look at it. And, you know, one of the things we'll finish with this, first of all, you're not going to have this little gray bar. This is a sort of print copy for me before we released it. But the picture that's on here is a picture of Dr. Geisler lecturing at the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy on the doctrine of inerrancy. So with that said, again, thank you. I'm going to put all the different links that you can find to get this book below. And I hope if you get it, please share it with your friends. Please give me hopefully a favorable review on Amazon. And again, I thank you. I appreciate you. Like and subscribe.